Show your loyalty to the Imperium. Subscribe, and state in the comments which enemy must be revealed next. They told me the creature was stupid. Brutal, dangerous, volatile, yes, but stupid. It was the only reason anyone agreed to bring an orc Weirdboy aboard my ship alive. We wrapped it in chains and hexagrammic wards, buried it in null fields, gagged it in 3 layers of adamantium, and still the air shook around it. I went in expecting rage and snarling. Instead, the first thing it did was laugh and tell me what I was going to say. My name is Kale Varian, Inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, and I have spent 43 years of service studying the enemies of mankind with methodical precision. I have dissected tyrannid bioforms, interrogated Eldar prisoners, catalogued the 1,000 varieties of heretical Xenos worship that fester in the forgotten corners of the Imperium. I approach my work with the cold rationality that separates humanity from the beasts we fight against, with the understanding that knowledge is the first weapon against any threat. I believed, as all proper servants of the Emperor believe, that the greenskin menace was a crude and predictable enemy, dangerous through numbers and brutality, but fundamentally simple, fundamentally stupid in the way that viruses and natural disasters are stupid. I was wrong. The campaign on Tertullus VII had been grinding and ugly, but ultimately successful by every metric that mattered to the Departamento Militarum. The orc invasion force that had descended on the agri-world 6 months prior had been systematically dismantled through proper application of Imperial doctrine, strategic bombardment from orbit, massed infantry assaults supported by armor, surgical elimination of leadership structures. The war boss, a particularly massive specimen that the Guard had taken to calling Guchopper, had been killed in a combined assault by 2 companies of Astra Militarum, supported by a lance of Lehman Russ battle tanks. His death had been confirmed through multiple sources, his severed head displayed on pikes outside the command post, and in the days that followed, the orc clans had fragmented exactly as Xenos behavioral models predicted they should. Mopping up operations were underway. Scattered bands of greenskins, now leaderless and disorganized, were being hunted through the ruined agricultural zones and burned manufactoria. Casualty rates were acceptable. Resource expenditure was within projected parameters. Every report that crossed my desk aboard the Sword of Reason suggested that Tertullus VII would be fully pacified within another 3 weeks, its population ready to resume food production for the subsector, the Xenos threat comprehensively eliminated. It was during this phase, when victory seemed assured and attention was already turning to the tedious work of reconstruction and compliance verification, that Captain Darren of the 44th Cadian brought me an unusual proposal. His regiment had been conducting clearing operations through the eastern industrial sectors when they had encountered something that gave even veteran greenskin fighters pause. An orc Weirdboy, apparently isolated from its mob, performing what appeared to be some kind of ritual in the burned-out shell of a grain processing facility. Weirdboys were known to be unstable, prone to self-destruction when separated from the psychic gestalt of the Waaagh that sustained them. Standard doctrine was to eliminate them at range with concentrated fire, as close-quarters engagement carried unacceptable risk of psychic backlash. But this one had not exploded or fled. It had simply sat in the center of a circle of scrap metal and corpses, both orc and human, and waited while Darren's men surrounded it. When they moved to execute it, 3 sanctioned psychers supporting the operation had simultaneously screamed warnings about unprecedented psychic activity, and the Weirdboy had laughed and spoken in broken low Gothic, offering surrender. It wanted to be captured, Inquisitor, Darren told me, his weathered face troubled in ways that decades of combat had not managed to produce. And when we brought the containment unit, it walked into it on its own, smiled the whole time. If you can call that expression a smile, my psychers are terrified of it. Say they can feel pressure building even through the null fields, like something enormous pressing against a dam. I should have ordered its immediate execution. Should have recognized the obvious tactical manipulation, the deliberate offering that no true greenskin should have been capable of conceiving. But I was curious, and curiosity is both the greatest strength and greatest weakness of the Inquisition. I wanted to understand what could drive an orc to surrender. What possible strategic calculation could motivate such behavior in a species supposedly driven by instinct and aggression rather than planning and foresight? So I authorized transport to the Sword of Reason, where we maintained interrogation facilities designed to contain even the most dangerous Xenos specimens. The Weirdboy was brought aboard in a reinforced containment cube, surrounded by an entire squad of stormtroopers, monitored by 3 sanctioned psychers and interrogator Rel, my junior aide, who had been pestering me for months to allow him observation of live Xenos interrogations. The security protocols were excessive by any rational standard, hexagrammic wards inscribed on every surface, null field generators operating at maximum power, enough adamantium chain to restrain a dreadnought, a gag mechanism that locked the creature's jaw and prevented vocalization beyond muffled grunts, and fail-safe melter charges positioned to vaporize the entire chamber if contamination was detected. Overkill, Rel muttered as we reviewed the preparations, his youth showing in both his confidence and his eagerness to impress. It's one greenskin, and a psyker at that. They're known to be unstable, self-limiting threats. The moment it tries anything, its own power will consume it. I let the comment pass without correction, because he was simply reciting doctrine I had helped write, principles built on decades of Imperial observation of Orc behavior. Weirdboys were walking time bombs, psychic lightning rods for the Gestalt Waaagh energy that powered Greenskin society. Isolated from their mobs, they typically suffered catastrophic psychic feedback and detonated in spectacular fashion. The longest recorded survival time for a captured Weirdboy was 17 hours, and that specimen had spent 15 of those hours unconscious. This one had been in custody for 2 days and showed no signs of distress. I entered the interrogation chamber alone. Standard protocol for initial assessment. The Weirdboy sat in the center of the room, bound to a reinforced throne by chains that allowed minimal movement, its head enclosed in a psychic dampening helm that covered everything but its eyes and made its already grotesque features even more disturbing. Those eyes, luminous green, far too intelligent, disturbingly focused, tracked my entrance with what I could only describe as anticipation. I approached with deliberate calm, data slate in hand, prepared to conduct a standard interrogation protocol, establish baseline responses, test comprehension of Gothic, probe for information about remaining Orc forces and strategic objectives. The questions were formulaic, designed to create psychological patterns I could analyze, and I had used variations of them hundreds of times across dozens of species. Designation, I said, my voice level and commanding. Clan affiliation. Number of surviving greenskin forces on Tertullus 7th. Purpose of the invasion. Command structure remaining after the elimination of your war boss. The Weirdboy's eyes crinkled at the corners, and I realized with unsettling certainty that it was smiling behind the gag. It made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a growl, but something that suggested amusement in ways that should have been impossible through the restrictions on its vocalization. Then it tilted its head slightly and fixed me with a stare that felt uncomfortably like recognition. One of the null field generators whined, its pitch changing subtly. I glanced at the monitoring station where sanctioned Psyker Talon sat, instruments arrayed before him, ready to detect any unauthorized psychic activity. He shook his head, indicating no breach, but his face was pale, and he kept wiping sweat from his forehead, despite the chamber's carefully controlled temperature. I looked back at the Weirdboy and found it still staring, still making that muffled sound of amusement. I raised the data slate, preparing to make notes on its behavioral responses, and the creature suddenly jerked its head forward, a tiny movement, barely perceptible, but timed with disturbing precision. My stylus slipped from my fingers and clattered to the floor. I stared at the fallen implement for a long moment, my transhuman enhanced mind already racing through explanations. Coincidence? My grip had been momentarily reduced due to dry air affecting skin moisture. The Weirdboy had simply moved at the same instant I happened to drop the stylus. Random correlation, not causation. Not. The Weirdboy made that sound again, louder now, definitely laughter. Its eyes gleamed with what could only be described as satisfaction. I picked up the stylus and continued the interrogation, refusing to acknowledge the incident, refusing to grant it significance. I asked about warp travel capabilities, about the origins of the invasion force, about whether there had been communication with other Orc enclaves in neighboring systems. Standard questions, methodical and comprehensive, designed to build a complete intelligence picture. The Weirdboy did not answer, did not grunt or gesture or provide any conventional response. It simply watched me with those unsettling green eyes, occasionally tilting its head as though listening to something I could not hear, and twice more made that muffled laughing sound at moments that seemed to have no obvious trigger. Then the primary lumen strips flickered. Just once, just for a fraction of a second, but noticeable in the otherwise perfectly regulated environment of the interrogation chamber. I looked up reflexively. My training demanding I note any environmental irregularity that might indicate equipment failure or security compromise. When I looked back down, the Weirdboy was nodding slowly, deliberately, as though confirming something. Psyker Talland, I called to the monitoring station. Status check. Any fluctuations in containment systems? None detected, Inquisitor, Talland responded, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. But I'm reading. Pressure. Like something building. The null fields are holding, but there's definitely psychic activity, just not in any pattern I recognize. It's almost like. He trailed off, struggling to find words for something outside his experience. Like what? Like counting. Like something counting down, or counting up. I can't tell which. But with a rhythm to it. A structure. Does that make sense? It did not make sense. Orc psychic phenomena were supposed to be chaotic, destructive, formless energy channeled through unstable vessels. Structure implied planning, organization, the kind of deliberate mental architecture that greenskins were fundamentally incapable of maintaining. I returned my attention to the Weirdboy, preparing to ask more pointed questions about its psychic capabilities and whether it was attempting to breach containment. But before I could speak, Interrogator Rel's voice came through the Vox link from the observation chamber, startling in its suddenness. Inquisitor, I was reviewing the preliminary behavioral analysis and I noticed. He stopped mid-sentence, coughed once, then continued. Sorry, throat dry. I noticed that. Another cough, this one harder, more pronounced. The Weirdboy was bouncing slightly in its restraints, making that muffled laughing sound with increased intensity. Its eyes fixed not on me but on the observation window where Rel stood. Apologies, Inquisitor, Rel managed, his voice rough. Must be something in the air recyclers. As I was saying, but I was no longer listening to Rel. I was staring at the Weirdboy, at the unmistakable expression of satisfaction on its partially visible face, at the way its eyes gleamed with what could only be recognition of having predicted, having known that Rel would cough at exactly that moment. 3 incidents. Stylus drop, lumen flicker, unexpected cough. None individually significant, but the pattern of the Weirdboy's reactions, the timing of its amusement, the sense that it was responding not to what was happening but to what it had known would happen. I approached closer to the restraint throne, close enough to see the fine details of orc physiology, the crude scarring, the fungal growths typical of their kind, the burn marks where psychic energy had scorched flesh, close enough to see its eyes tracking my movement with disturbing precision, as though it was watching a predicted path rather than reacting to an unexpected approach. What are you? I asked quietly, abandoning standard interrogation protocol in favor of direct confrontation. The Weirdboy made no attempt to answer, could not answer through the gag that locked its jaw, but its eyes crinkled again in that disturbing smile, and it tilted its head to the side in a gesture that felt mockingly curious, as though it was asking me the question, as though I was the puzzle it was studying rather than the reverse. I stepped back, made additional notes on the data slate about abnormal behavioral responses and possible psychic leakage despite null field containment, and concluded the interrogation session. Standard procedure called for extended isolation periods between sessions to prevent psychic adaptation or conditioning effects. I would return in 3 days to resume questioning. As I walked toward the exit, preparing to seal the enhanced containment protocols, the Weirdboy suddenly jerked forward against its chains with enough force to produce a metallic shriek of stressed metal. I turned reflexively, hand moving to the digital weapon holstered at my hip, but the creature was not attacking or attempting escape. It was simply staring at me with tremendous intensity, and through the gag I could hear it making sounds, syllables, almost words, fighting against the restraints on its speech. Talon's voice came panicked through the Vox. Inquisitor, massive spike in psychic activity. It's concentrating everything, burning through the null fields by sheer. The Weirdboy's jaw unlocked, not through mechanical failure, but through the application of such focused psychic force that the adamantium restraints simply bent, metal flowing like water under pressure that should have killed the creature applying it. Its mouth opened, and it spoke in low Gothic that was rough and accented, but perfectly comprehensible, each word bitten off with deliberate precision. See you in 4 fights, boss. Then it slumped back in its restraints. the gag mechanism re-engaging with a snap, the psychic pressure vanishing so completely that Talend gasped in relief. The Weirdboy's eyes closed, its body going limp, giving every indication of having exhausted itself completely in that single moment of communication. I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind processing the implications of what I had just witnessed. 4 fights. The creature had predicted no, had promised that I would see it again in 4 fights. But I had no scheduled interrogations for combat analysis. We were in the cleanup phase of operations. There were no 4 fights planned. The campaign was effectively over. I sealed the chamber and convened an immediate security review with my senior staff. We analyzed every second of the interrogation recording, subjected the Weirdboy to additional scans while it remained unconscious, verified all containment systems were functioning within normal parameters. Everything checked out. The creature had somehow forced momentary speech through restraints, designed to be absolutely reliable, but had done so at such cost that it now appeared to be in a state of deep psychic exhaustion that might persist for days. Meaningless vocalization, Rel suggested, eager to demonstrate analytical thinking. Greenskins are known to speak in fragments of languages they've heard. Without true comprehension, it probably overheard guard soldiers talking about battles and simply repeated sounds that seemed threatening. Talend was less certain. The psychic effort required to break that gag should have killed it, should have caused massive hemorrhaging, system failure, probably explosive decompression of its brain matter, but it did it anyway, with obvious purpose, to deliver a specific message. That suggests. He hesitated, unwilling to complete the thought. Suggests what? I prompted. Suggests it believed the message was worth dying to deliver. And greenskins don't typically value communication over survival. They value fighting over survival. 4 fights. I filed the phrase in my report logs and tried to dismiss it as Rel had suggested meaningless noise from a Xeno's brain, unable to process proper Gothic syntax. But as I worked through the evening's accumulated reports from the surface, processing casualty figures and terrain assessments and resource allocation requests, I found myself counting. The skirmish near the Eastern Manufactorum district, where a band of feral orcs had been eliminated, 1 fight. The ambush in the Agrizone 17, where guard patrols had destroyed a greenskin supply cache, 2 fights. The running battle through the southern mountain passes where fleeing orc survivors had been caught and annihilated, 3 fights. The assault on the underground warren where the last known organized resistance had been crushed, 4 fights. 4 fights, all occurring in the 3 days between that interrogation and my scheduled return to the chamber. 4 fights that I had not planned, had not anticipated, but which had unfolded with the inexorable logic of military necessity and tactical opportunity. 4 fights that had simply happened. I told myself it was coincidence. Military operations generated their own momentum, their own requirements for engagement based on intelligence and terrain and enemy disposition. The number 4 had no significance. Orcs could not predict Imperial tactical decisions days in advance. The Weirdboy had made a random noise that happened to correlate with subsequent events through sheer probability. But as I prepared to return to the interrogation chamber, I found myself counting the fights that had occurred, and the count was exactly 4, and the Weirdboy had said it would see me in 4 fights, and some cold, rational part of my mind whispered that coincidence had limits, that pattern had meaning, that I was missing something fundamental about what I was dealing with. The creature was awake when I entered, its eyes bright and alert despite 3 days of isolation, and the moment I crossed the threshold, before I could speak, before I could begin the planned interrogation sequence, it made that muffled laughing sound again, as though it had been waiting, as though it had known exactly when I would return, as though it had counted the fights just as I had. The war below continued with the grinding inevitability of Imperial military doctrine meeting Xenos resistance, methodical, brutal, apparently successful by every conventional metric. Casualty reports crossed my desk in steady streams. Orc mobs broken up and destroyed, individual greenskins hunted through ruins and waste zones, strategic points secured and fortified. The numbers looked good. The trend lines pointed toward inevitable pacification. Every senior officer agreed that Tertullus Savathund was weeks, perhaps days, away from being declared secure. But I found myself reviewing those reports with increasing unease, looking for patterns that I could not quite articulate, feeling the shape of something wrong without being able to point to specific evidence of wrongness. The combat operations were succeeding. The orcs were being eliminated. And yet the rhythm of it, the spacing of engagements, the particular locations where contact occurred, all of it felt less like the Imperium hunting scattered remnants and more like pieces moving on a board, according to rules I didn't understand. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the practical work of interrogating a captured Xenos, of extracting useful intelligence that might accelerate the final stages of pacification. The Weirdboy remained in maximum containment, monitored constantly, subjected to every scanning protocol the Ordo Xenos had developed over millennia of studying Greenskin's psychic phenomena. Nothing in our accumulated data suggested it should still be alive, let alone functional. The isolation from Waaagh energy should have caused catastrophic psychic feedback within hours. The null fields should have suppressed any residual psychic capability. But the creature showed no signs of deterioration, no indication of the instability that was supposed to define its kind. The second interrogation began much like the first standard questions: methodical documentation, careful observation of behavioral responses. I asked about the Greenskin command structure, about tribal hierarchies and clan allegiances, about the technological capabilities of the orc forces that had invaded Tertullus VII. The Weirdboy did not answer, did not respond in any conventional sense, but its eyes tracked my movements with that same disturbing intelligence, that same sense of watching something expected rather than something surprising. Then, in the middle of my questioning about orc manufacturing capacity, the creature made a sound, not laughter this time, but something that almost resembled speech despite the gag, a forcing of air through restricted passages that produced syllables in crude but recognizable low Gothic. Big, scrap, Sector 9 to 7. Many boss boys, Hume soldiers, come from 3 sides. It paused, head tilting as though listening. Lots of Dakar. Many dead. Boss in red coat. Takes bullet. Right shoal. The words cut off as the gag mechanism adjusted, responding to the Weirdboy's attempt at speech. But the creature had conveyed enough. I froze. Data slate suspended in mid-notation, my mind processing what I had just heard. Sector 9 to 7 was where Captain Derren's regiment was currently conducting clearing operations. A big scrap would mean significant contact, likely a larger concentration of orcs than anticipated. 3-sided approach matched standard Imperial encirclement tactics, and boss in red coat could only refer to Lord Militant Gen, who affected an archaic style of dress that included a crimson ceremonial coat despite its tactical impracticality. But the fighting in Sector 9 to 7 was happening now, had been ongoing for approximately 3 hours, according to the last Vox report I'd received. The Weirdboy was describing current events with specificity that should have been impossible for a creature locked in the heart of my ship, isolated from all information sources, blind to the tactical situation dozens of kilometers below. I activated the Vox link to the bridge. This is Inquisitor Varian. I need immediate tactical updates from Sector 9 to 7. Priority classification. Void Master. Elira's response came quickly, her voice carrying the clipped efficiency of someone managing multiple crisis situations simultaneously. Inquisitor, Sector 9 to 7 is currently active combat. We're receiving fragmented reports, larger orc force than anticipated, coordinated resistance. Guard elements executing encirclement from 3 vectors. Lord Militant Gen is personally directing the operation. Last update suggests. Wait, emergency Vox. Stand by. The seconds stretched while I stood in the interrogation chamber, watching the Weirdboy watch me, seeing satisfaction in those luminous green eyes. Taland had risen from his monitoring station, was staring at the creature with naked fear, his psychic senses clearly detecting something that his instruments could not measure or quantify. Elira returned, her voice tight. Confirmed casualty report. Lord Militant Gen has been wounded, projectile impact to the right shoulder. Non-fatal. He's being evacuated for field surgery. Operation continues under Colonel Drem's command. I terminated the Vox link and approached the Weirdboy slowly, my mind racing through explanations that became less credible with each step. The creature had described events that were happening in real time, had known details that were classified tactical information, had predicted a specific injury to a specific officer with impossible accuracy. This was not lucky guessing. This was not psychic impression bleeding through null fields. This was knowledge, detailed and precise, delivered with casual certainty. How? I demanded, abandoning interrogation protocol entirely. "How do you know what's happening down there?" The Weirdboy's eyes crinkled in that disturbing smile. It made no attempt to speak again, having apparently exhausted its capacity to force words through the gag, but it tapped one thick green finger against the side of its psychic dampening helm once, twice, 3 times in a rhythm that felt mockingly deliberate, as though counting something I was failing to perceive. Over the following week, I returned to the interrogation chamber 6 more times, and each time I witnessed predictions that ranged from eerily accurate to impossibly specific. The Weirdboy would make sounds that approximated words, or would gesture with the limited movement its restraints allowed, or would simply stare at certain moments while Talon reported spikes in localized psychic activity. And each time, within hours or days, events would unfold exactly as the creature had suggested. A Vox relay station that the Weirdboy had gestured toward on a tactical map was destroyed in an Orc raid that supposedly isolated survivors should not have been capable of coordinating. An ammunition depot that the creature had shown particular interest in staring at its map position, with intense focus, exploded due to faulty storage protocols. That investigation revealed was likely sabotage by Orc infiltrators no one knew existed. A guard patrol route that the Weirdboy had traced with one clawed finger in the air, miming the movement, was ambushed with precision that suggested advanced planning rather than opportunistic violence. But what disturbed me more than the predictions themselves was what began happening to my staff. Interrogator Rel, who had been so confident in his dismissal of Greenskin intelligence, started using Orc terminology in his daily reports. Not obviously, not frequently enough to seem like conscious mimicry, but small phrases would slip in. Lots of Daka instead of heavy weapons fire, big stompy instead of armored vehicle, proper scrap instead of significant engagement. When I mentioned it, he looked confused, claimed he had no memory of using such language, assured me he would be more careful about maintaining proper Gothic in official documentation. Captain Darren, who had captured the Weirdboy and delivered it to me, began advocating for more aggressive tactics in his operational planning, not reckless, not suicidal, but increasingly focused on direct confrontation rather than the methodical clearing operations that had been working successfully. "Something about this feels right tactically," he told me during one briefing, describing a proposed assault on an Orc position that matched almost exactly a scenario the Weirdboy had seemed to reference days earlier through crude gestures and forced syllables. Sanctioned Psyker Talon was suffering worst. He spent hours each day monitoring the Weirdboy, maintaining psychic vigilance against any attempt to breach containment, and the exposure was clearly affecting him. He complained of headaches that standard medical intervention could not relieve. He reported dreams of green tides and counting voices that spoke in languages he didn't recognize but somehow understood. And during one interrogation session, when the Weirdboy was making its muffled approximations of speech, Talon suddenly whispered along with it the same syllables, the same rhythm, perfectly synchronized. When the Weirdboy finished, Talon gasped and staggered, his face gray with shock. "I heard it," he said, his voice barely audible. "Not through the air, through the pressure, like something vast counting down or counting up, I still can't tell which, and I was part of the count. I was one of the numbers, and it knew exactly which number I was. I ordered him to take a 3-day rest period, to undergo psychic cleansing and cognitive realignment, but when he returned to duty, his first words to me were spoken in a slight Orc accent, and when I mentioned it, he did not remember speaking at all. The pattern I had been sensing became impossible to ignore. The Weirdboy was not simply predicting events, it was describing a structure, a sequence, a progression that was unfolding across the entire campaign. Every major engagement followed patterns it had suggested. Every tactical decision we made seemed to align with frameworks it had referenced through its fragmented communications. We were succeeding in our operations, eliminating Orcs, securing territory, but we were doing so in ways that matched the creature's expectations with such precision that coincidence stopped being a viable explanation. I began testing it deliberately. During one interrogation, I fabricated information told the Weirdboy that we were planning a major orbital strike on the northern industrial zones, a complete invention meant to gauge its reaction and see if it would attempt to predict outcomes for non-existent operations. The creature listened, head tilted, eyes gleaming, and then made that muffled laughing sound that I had come to dread. 2 days later, The actual orbital strike authorization came through from Fleet Command, targeting the northern industrial zones, where long-range augurs had detected unexpected Orc concentrations. The operation had been planned at the highest levels of command. Classified information I had not been briefed on, orders that had not existed when I fed the Weirdboy false information. But it had known, had laughed at my attempt at deception because it understood that my fiction would become fact, that the lie I told would manifest as truth because the underlying pattern demanded it. I confronted it directly, removing the gag briefly under maximum security protocols, with Talon and 3 other sanctioned psychers maintaining suppression fields and ready to destroy the creature if it attempted any hostile psychic action. The moment the restraint released, the Weirdboy grinned with genuine pleasure, displaying teeth like broken tombstones. "You see it now, Humie boss," it said, its voice a grinding rasp that nevertheless carried a tone of satisfaction. "You's counting with me. You just don't like dar answers." "I am not counting anything with you," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "I am conducting a military operation using rational tactical analysis." Yay, the Weirdboy agreed, nodding enthusiastically. "Ratio now. Very smart like. You make us the numbers add up all proper. Make sure the boys go where the fighting is thickest, where the red bits pile up bestest." It leaned forward against its chains, eyes gleaming with that terrible intelligence. "But who taught you how to count, hey boss? Who showed you which numbers matter? You are confined, isolated. You have no access to tactical information, no way to influence Imperial operations. Your predictions are already happened," the Weirdboy interrupted, speaking with sudden clarity that made Talon flinch and the other psychers step back reflexively. "I don't tell you what's gonna happen, Humie boss. I tell you what already is happening. What's already been counted up by dar big green momentum you can't see but what pushes on everything anyway. Where dar fighting is loudest, where the wheels and guns wanna go, where dar Waaagh makes its mark." It paused, cocked its head to one side. "And you's helping. Every time you try to be clever, every time you adjust and adapt and make your smart Humie plans, you's just counting along wive the rest." I ordered the gag replaced and ended the interrogation. But that night, alone in my quarters, I reviewed every tactical decision made since the Weirdboy's capture, every operation authorized, every resource allocation approved, and I saw it the pattern the creature had described. The way our successful operations were aligning with a structure that I had not chosen, had not planned, but which I had somehow been following as though reading from a script I didn't know existed. The Orcs were losing, we were winning, but we were winning in exactly the way the Weirdboy had predicted we would, and I could not determine whether that was because it was reading our actions accurately or because we were unconsciously conforming to its predictions. The distinction seemed critical, but I could not find evidence to support either conclusion, could not prove which direction the causality flowed, so I decided to test it more rigorously. I ordered a complete halt to all major offensive operations for a period of 48 hours, a decision that brought protests from multiple commanders who argued that momentum must be maintained, that giving the Orcs time to regroup was tactically unsound. I overrode them with inquisitorial authority, forced a pause in the campaign, determined to break whatever synchronization had developed between our operations and the Weirdboy's predictions. During those 48 hours, I returned to the interrogation chamber and told the creature what I had done, explained that I had stopped the counting, broken the pattern, proven that Imperial will was sovereign over whatever psychic momentum it believed existed. The Weirdboy listened, made no muffled sounds of laughter, showed no reaction beyond a slow, deliberate nod. Then it raised one hand as far as its chains permitted and began tapping fingers against its palm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, counting out a rhythm that Talon later told me matched exactly with the psychic pressure pulses he was detecting despite null field suppression. 20 hours into the operational pause, an Orc raid hit a supposedly secure supply depot, an attack that should have been impossible given the guard presence in that sector, that required the kind of coordination leaderless greenskin remnants should not have possessed. Responding to the raid required deploying forces, which required tactical authorization, which required breaking the operational pause I had ordered. 37 hours into the pause, a civilian uprising occurred in one of the reclaimed city's workers influenced by residual Orc psychic contamination. or perhaps simply exhausted by months of war and deprivation, turning violent in ways that demanded immediate suppression. More forces deployed, more operations authorized, the pause eroding not through direct violation but through the accumulation of necessary responses to unexpected crises. At exactly 48 hours, I received emergency authorization from Fleet Command to resume full offensive operations due to intelligence suggesting Orc forces were using the lull to consolidate in dangerous patterns. The order came from levels of command I could not override without triggering investigations that would compromise the security classification of my interrogation project. The pause ended. Operations resumed, and when I returned to the interrogation chamber, the Weirdboy was bouncing slightly in its restraints, making that muffled sound that could have been laughter or could have been something else, something worse, the sound of recognition, of watching a prediction fulfilled, of seeing patterns complete themselves despite all attempts to disrupt them. You tried. Hume boss. It managed to force through the gag, the words barely intelligible but the meaning crystal clear. But da countin' don't stop just, 'cause you's not looking at da numbers. And the terrible thing, the thought that kept me awake through that night and many nights following, was that I was beginning to believe it was right. The raids intensified over the following week, and the pattern the Weirdboy had described, da thick places. The locations where violence concentrated like gravity around massive objects became impossible to dismiss as coincidence or psychic impression. Orc forces that our intelligence had assessed as scattered and directionless were converging on specific points across Tertullus 7, the ravines northwest of Manufactorum Complex 7, the abandoned silo cities in the southern agricultural zones, the labyrinth of service tunnels beneath the capital hive. These were not random movements. They suggested coordination, planning, strategic thinking that contradicted everything the Imperium knew about how greenskins behaved after losing their leadership structure. I brought my concerns to Lord Militant Gen, whose shoulder wound had been treated and who had returned to field command with characteristic stubbornness. He listened to my analysis, reviewed the tactical maps where I had marked the convergence points, and his expression shifted from polite attention to genuine concern. "You're suggesting the Orcs are following some kind of strategic plan," he said slowly. "Without a war boss, without any command structure we've been able to identify. Just organizing themselves spontaneously in patterns that seem almost intelligent. I'm suggesting that there may be an underlying structure to Waaagh behavior that we don't fully understand," I said carefully, not mentioning the Weirdboy's predictions because doing so would have required explanations that violated operational security. Something that persists even after visible leadership is eliminated. Gen studied the maps for a long moment, then began issuing new operational orders, redeployments to counter the Orc concentrations, reinforcements for sectors that our analysis suggested were at risk. His orders were tactically sound, exactly what doctrine demanded, but as I watched him work, I felt a growing unease, because the sectors he was reinforcing, the routes he was establishing for supply and communication, matched almost exactly the patterns the Weirdboy had gestured toward during our most recent interrogation. I had not told Gen about those gestures, had not shared the detailed predictions, but he was making decisions that aligned with them anyway, as though the underlying logic of war was guiding him toward the same conclusions the Weirdboy had reached through its incomprehensible Orc calculations. That night, I decided to test something more extreme. I authorized a biological scan of the Weirdboy, had Medica Servitors analyze its physiology at the molecular level, searching for any exotic technology or warp corruption that might explain its predictive capabilities. The scans revealed nothing beyond standard Orc biology, crude organs, fungal symbiosis, psychic glands enlarged beyond typical parameters, but not unusual for a Weirdboy specimen. There was no implanted technology, no demonic possession, no evidence of anything except a green-skinned psycho with abnormally high coherence despite isolation from its Waaagh. Frustrated, I returned to the interrogation chamber and tried a different approach. Instead of asking questions or demanding information, I simply fed the Weirdboy false intelligence told it. Through carefully scripted statements that I read as though conveying real tactical updates, that Imperial forces were planning to withdraw from the southern agricultural zones, that we were consolidating around the capital hive, that we had decided the outlying territories were not worth the resources required to fully pacify them. The Weirdboy listened attentively, its eyes tracking my face as I spoke, and when I finished it tilted its head to one side and made that muffled sound that I had learned meant disagreement or contradiction. Then it began gesturing with the limited movement its chains allowed, pointing to specific locations on the map displayed on the wall, tapping out numbers with its thick fingers, miming movements that suggested troop deployments and vehicle routes. I watched, taking notes. Not because I believed the information had value, but because I wanted to document how completely the creature had bought into my fabrication. If it predicted Imperial actions based on false intelligence, if its pattern reading failed when fed corrupted data, that would prove its predictions were based on information rather than genuine foresight. 72 hours later, the actual orders came through from Subsector Command. Redeploy forces from the southern agricultural zones. Consolidate around the capital hive, except that outlying territories cannot be fully secured, given current resource constraints. The exact strategy I had invented as fiction, the exact plan I had described to the Weirdboy as a deceptive test, had become reality through command decisions made at levels far above my clearance by officers who could not possibly have been exposed to my fabrications. The Weirdboy, when I returned to confront it, was making that muffled laughing sound before I even entered the chamber. Talland reported massive psychic pressure spikes, described feeling like standing next to something vast and amused. And when I demanded to know how the creature could have known about orders that didn't exist when I spoke to it, it managed to force words through the gag despite the enhanced restraints. Told ya, boss. Already happened. You just hadn't counted it yet. That's impossible. Those orders were issued by Subsector Command, by officers you have never encountered, based on strategic assessments you have no access to, based on where Dar fightin' is, the Weirdboy interrupted, speaking with unusual clarity through tremendous psychic effort that made its eyes blaze green and caused Talon to cry out in pain from psychic feedback, based on where Dar Humie boys can go, where Dar red bits stack up, where Dar momentum pushes. You didn't make dose orders, boss. Dar Waaagh made 'em. You just wrote 'em down. I ordered everyone out of the chamber, sealed myself alone with the creature despite protocol violations that would have brought censure from any reviewing authority. I needed to understand, needed to break through whatever was happening here, needed to prove that human will and Imperial doctrine were not being shaped by greenskin psychic pressure that should have been impossible for a contained specimen to generate. Explain, I demanded. Explain how you know what decisions will be made before they're made. Explain how you predict outcomes of battles that haven't been fought. Explain what you mean by the Waaagh made the orders. The Weirdboy regarded me with what I was increasingly certain was pity, as though I was a child struggling with mathematics that should have been obvious. Then it settled back into its restraints and spoke at length, forcing words through enhanced gags and null fields with psychic effort that should have killed it but somehow didn't, painting a picture of reality that violated everything I understood about causality and free will. Waaagh ain't just a boys fightin', it said. Waaagh is like when you throw a big stone in water, yay, makes ripples, makes waves, pushes on everything around it. Dar bigger dar stone, dar bigger dar wave, dar bigger da Waaagh, dar more, it pushes on everything, even da things dat ain't green, even da humie boys with all their fancy thinks and rules. You're describing psychic pressure affecting decision-making. That's not prediction, that's just influence. Nah, the Weirdboy insisted, shaking its head vigorously. Ain't pushin' on thoughts, boss. Pushin' on dar shape of things, on where violence goes, where it wants to go, where it has to go, cause of how many boys are where, how much red stuff is already there, how the ground lays and day guns point, and all the little bits date add up to day big momentum. It paused, seemed to struggle with how to explain something that was obvious to its alien perspective, but nearly incomprehensible to human logic. It's like, you got a hill, yay, and ya got water at dar top. Water gonna run downhill. Don't matter if dar water wants to go uphill. Don't matter if you tell the water it should go uphill. Gravity don't care, momentum don't care. Water goes where dar shape of things make as it go. And you're saying the Waaagh is gravity? That it shapes how battles unfold regardless of tactical decisions? Waaagh is the shape that violence makes when enough boys are fighting. And once that shape exists, once the momentum is going, everything else humie boys, decisions, orders, all that it flows along that shape like water down da hill. Ya think you's choosing where to fight. But da shape already chose. Yeah, just following da momentum and calling it tactics. I wanted to reject this utterly. Wanted to assert that Imperial commanders were not water flowing downhill, that human intellect and strategic training could not be reduced to predictable responses to battlefield momentum. But I thought about the orders that had aligned with my fabrications, about the tactical decisions that matched the Weirdboys' gestures, about Gen and Darren and all the other officers unconsciously adopting Orc terminology and making choices that fulfilled predictions they had never heard. If what you're describing is true, I said slowly, if battlefield momentum is determining our actions rather than the reverse, then you should be able to predict future operations with specificity. Not vague suggestions about where fighting will be heavy, but exact descriptions of what will happen, when, where. The Weirdboy's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Yay, boss. Yay. I can tell ya. Been counting the whole time. 9 more big booms, that's your orbital strikers. 5 more proper scraps the kind where lots of humy boys die. 3 more times you come here before. It paused, head tilting. Before it all comes together, before da shape completes and da big green momentum makes its mark. You're counting down to something. Counting up to something, it corrected. To the peak. To day moment when the Waaagh that you thought you killed reaches its proper size, its proper shape, cause of all the fighting and bleeding and counting that's been happening while you thought you was winning. I felt something cold settle in my chest. You're saying we haven't been winning? That everything we've accomplished, eliminating the war boss, destroying the Orc clans, securing territory, all of it has been building towards something rather than preventing something. You been winning the fights, the Weirdboy agreed. But losen the count. Cause every fight adds to the momentum. Every dead boy feeds the Waaagh. Every decision you make based on where the fighting is, that's just following the shape that already exists. It paused. And the best part, the absolutely proper funny bit, you can't stop counting now even if you try, cause stopping would mean not fighting. And not fighting means the boys you haven't found yet get stronger while you wait. So you fight. And every fight proves I counted right. I left the chamber with my mind racing, spent the next 3 days reviewing every tactical decision made since the campaign began, looking for evidence to refute what the Weirdboy had described. I found none. Found instead patterns that suggested we had been unconsciously concentrating our forces exactly where Orc resistance was strongest, where casualties were highest, where the shape of violence was most pronounced. We called it sound tactics, engaging the enemy where they gathered, preventing them from consolidating, maintaining offensive pressure. But viewed through the framework the Weirdboy had described, it looked less like strategic choice and more like water flowing downhill, following the path of least resistance carved by accumulated violence. I began checking the Weirdboy's predictions compulsively, cross-referencing its countings with actual operations. The 9 orbital bombardments it had mentioned occurred over 8 days, each authorized through standard tactical necessity, each targeting locations that the creature had gestured toward or referenced obliquely during interrogations. The 5 major battles it predicted unfolded with horrifying accuracy, down to casualty estimates and approximate durations. And 3 more times I returned to the interrogation chamber, compelled by a need to understand that was becoming indistinguishable from dependency. Each visit confirming the countdown it had described, each conversation revealing more about how Orc momentum and Imperial response were locked in a pattern neither side could escape, because both were following the same underlying structure, the same gravitational pull of violence seeking resolution. Captain Darren came to me after one particularly brutal engagement, his face grey with fatigue and something else, confusion, fear, cognitive dissonance that was breaking through his military conditioning. "Inquisitor," he said quietly, "I need to report something that may constitute, I don't know, compromise, corruption, something. Report," I commanded, though I already knew what he would say. During the assault on Manufactorum Complex 7, I made tactical decisions that felt wrong. Not incorrect, they worked. They were successful, but wrong in that I couldn't explain why I was making them. Like someone else was running the calculations, and I was just following orders from a voice I couldn't hear. He paused, jaw tight, and when I was reviewing the after-action reports, I found myself writing in what I can only describe as Orc syntax. Not translating my thoughts into their language, but thinking in their logical structures and only afterward converting to proper Gothic. What did you write? That the engagement was proper, that our forces got stuck in Gud, that the momentum was building to something big. He looked at me directly. Inquisitor, am I compromised? Have I been exposed to psychic contamination that's affecting my cognition? I wanted to reassure him, wanted to say he was fine, that he was simply exhausted from months of sustained combat. But I thought about everyone else showing similar symptoms, thought about my own growing inability to make decisions without unconsciously referencing the patterns the Weirdboy had described, and I realized we were all compromised not by direct psychic attack, but by exposure to a framework of understanding that revealed patterns we couldn't unsee once we knew to look for them. You're not contaminated, I told Darren, choosing words carefully. You're becoming aware of how the enemy thinks, how they calculate, how they perceive momentum and structure in violence. That awareness is making their logic more visible to you. It's useful, but dangerous. Should I request reassignment? Psychic cleansing? No, I said, because removing him would only mean replacing him with someone less aware, someone who would follow the same patterns without recognizing them, and at least Darren could see what was happening, even if he couldn't stop it. But I need you to document every decision that feels wrong in the way you described. Every time you find yourself thinking in orc logic structures, I need data. He left, and I added his reports to the growing pile of evidence that we were all being shaped by proximity to orc psychic architecture, that the Weirdboys' predictions were working not because it was forcing us to act against our will, but because it was making us aware of the underlying patterns we had been following all along without conscious recognition. That night, I decided the Weirdboy had to die. Not in days or weeks, but immediately. Whatever it was doing, whatever pattern it was revealing or creating, ended with its execution. I prepared the authorization personally, scheduled it for the following morning, coordinated with security forces and sanctioned psychers to ensure there would be no possibility of escape or final psychic assault. As I was finalizing the paperwork, I realized I was writing the authorization in the exact phrasing the Weirdboy had once muttered during an interrogation. Proper ending, clean kill, no mucking about. I had not consciously recalled those words, had not deliberately incorporated them into my formal execution order. But there they were, embedded in my high Gothic like fragments of broken glass in flesh. I stared at the document for a long time, then checked the scheduled execution time against the temporal countdown the Weirdboy had referenced. The numbers matched. I had scheduled the execution for the exact moment it had predicted, proper ending, the moment when its counting would complete. I had thought I was asserting control, proving that Imperial will could disrupt the pattern, but I was simply following it to its inevitable conclusion, playing my assigned role in a sequence that had been determined by momentum and violence, and the accumulated weight of decisions that had seemed free, but were actually constrained by circumstances neither I nor the Weirdboy had created. The creature had not forced this schedule, had not manipulated me into this timing. I had chosen it freely, based on tactical necessity and operational security, but I had chosen it at exactly the moment the pattern demanded, because that was when the shape of events made execution the only logical response. I went to the interrogation chamber one final time, told the Weirdboy it would die tomorrow at dawn. It nodded slowly, made that muffled sound that was not quite laughter, and managed to force words through enhanced restraints one last time. Knew da when, knew da why, knew how y'd signed the papers. It paused. One more thing, boss. Before I go, you wanna ask where you die, I can see it. Can tell ya, make your last hours a bit more interesting, yeah? I stood at the chamber entrance, one hand on the door seal, and I felt my entire life balanced on that question. Everything I was Inquisitor, servant of the Emperor, defender of humanity demanded I refuse, demanded I deny the creature any final satisfaction. But everything I had become the part that counted battles and recognized patterns and saw momentum in violence wanted desperately to know, to understand the shape that was pulling me forward. No, I said finally. I will not ask. The Weirdboy nodded, approval in those alien eyes. Already asked it in your heart, boss. Already counted da question. Just ain't counted da answer yet. I sealed the chamber and walked away, and I did not look back, because I knew that if I did, I would see its expression of satisfaction, and I would understand that my refusal had been predicted too, that every choice I thought I was making freely was just another step in a dance choreographed by forces larger than individual will. The execution would happen tomorrow. The pattern would complete, and I would learn, too late, whether the Weirdboy's death would break the momentum or simply mark its culmination. The execution was prepared with methodical precision that felt less like military efficiency and more like ritual observance. 3 sanctioned psychers were stationed around the restraint throne, their minds linked in a suppression field designed to prevent any final psychic assault. Stormtroopers with hellguns surrounded the chamber, firing arcs calculated to intersect on the Weirdboy's head with enough energy to vaporize it and the psychic glands that generated its power. Fail-safe melter charges had been positioned throughout the room, ready to liquefy everything within if containment was breached. Every contingency had been planned for, every risk assessed and mitigated. I arrived at dawn as scheduled, found the execution team assembled and ready, all personnel showing the kind of nervous tension that came from preparing to kill something that had proven far more dangerous than its restraints suggested it should be capable of being. Talland looked particularly strained, his face pale and drawn, eyes sunken from what he claimed were pressure dreams. Visions of green momentum building to some critical threshold that his psychic senses could feel approaching but could not clearly perceive. The Weirdboy was waiting, perfectly calm, its luminous eyes tracking my entrance with what I could only interpret as satisfaction. When I stood before it, preparing to deliver the formal declaration of sentence and the theological justifications for xenocide that inquisitorial protocol demanded, it made that muffled sound again, and despite the gag, despite all the restraints designed to prevent vocalization, it spoke with perfect clarity. "Before we do this proper, boss, I want to say thinking. Ya been good sport. Ya tried to fight da momentum, tried to break da pattern, tried to prove who me will was stronger than da shape of violence." It paused. "Ya failed, but you tried. That's worth something." "I did not fail," I said, my voice carrying conviction I did not entirely feel. "I am executing you precisely because your predictions have proven dangerous, because your influence has compromised operational clarity, because you counted up all the fights and all the booms and all the decisions you made that lined up with what I said would happen, and you realized you couldn't tell if I was predicting or if you was following." The Weirdboy interrupted. "And that scared you more than any Daka ever could, 'cause it meant maybe Humy boys ain't as free as they think they are. Maybe you're just water running downhill like I said. I wanted to deny this, wanted to assert human sovereignty over circumstance, but I had spent too many nights reviewing battle reports that matched the creature's predictions, too many hours watching my officers unconsciously adopt its terminology and follow its suggested patterns, too many moments of recognizing my own thoughts forming in orc logical structures before I translated them back into proper Gothic. "Your death ends this," I said firmly. "Ends the pattern, ends the predictions, proves that the Imperium controls its own destiny." The Weirdboy tilted its head, eyes gleaming with that terrible intelligence. "Ya think that, boss? Ya think killing me stops the momentum? I ain't the Waaagh. I just see it. I just count it. I's like a Humy looking at ya shadow, and telling ya where you're standing. Killing me don't kill the shadow, don't change where you're standing, just means no one's left to tell you what shape you're making. Then it makes no difference whether you live or die," I said. "If you're simply observing patterns rather than creating them, your execution cannot affect outcomes." "Didn't say it don't make difference, boss. Said it don't stop the momentum." The Weirdboy leaned forward against its chains, voice dropping to something almost gentle. "But it do complete something. It do mark the moment when all the counting adds up, when da shape finalizes, when da Waaagh you thought you killed reaches its proper size." It paused. "Which is why I want to make you one last offer, one last bit of knowing before I go. I should have refused, should have ordered the execution to proceed immediately, ended this psychological warfare before it could undermine the certainty I needed to maintain. But I was tired, and I was curious, and I had spent too long counting alongside this creature not to want resolution to the pattern it had been describing. What offer? Ask me where you die. Ask me when. Ask me how da shape of violence dat you's been following ends for you personal like." Its eyes gleamed with sincere interest rather than malice. "I can see it, boss. Clear as anything. and it might be useful knowing. Might let you make peace with it, might let you prepare, or might just let you spend your last days knowing exactly what's coming. The offer hung in the air between us, and I felt my entire understanding of duty and service balanced on the decision of whether to accept, knowing the time and manner of my death would be both liberation and cursed freedom from uncertainty, but also the burden of counting down to an endpoint I could not avoid. And if the Weirdboy's previous predictions were any indication, asking would mean receiving an answer that would prove accurate with horrifying precision. "I refuse," I said, my voice steady despite the uncertainty churning beneath. "I will not give you the satisfaction of proving your predictions extend even to my personal fate." The Weirdboy nodded slowly, and I saw in its expression something that looked almost like approval. "Yeah, already asked it in your heart, boss. Already counted the question while you was lying awake at night thinking about all the ways this could end. I can see it in your eyes, in how you stand, in da little countings you do without knowing you's doing 'em." It paused. "But you ain't counted the answer yet. Still holding on to da idea that maybe it ain't fixed, maybe it ain't inevitable, maybe human will can change da shape." "Then I choose to maintain that uncertainty," I said firmly. "To die without your predictions in my head, without spending whatever time remains counting down to your expectations." "Fair," the Weirdboy agreed. "Proper even. Shows you still got fight in you, even knowing it won't change nothing." Its eyes crinkled in that disturbing smile. "But here's the thing, boss, the thing that's gonna keep you up at night for however long you got left. You refused to answer, but dark questions still in your head, still counting, still wondering. And every fight you survive, every day you wake up, you's gonna be asking yourself, is this da one? Is this when da shape completes for me? Is this where I stop counting?" It was psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind, and I recognized it even as I felt its hooks settling into my consciousness. By refusing the answer, I had condemned myself to perpetual uncertainty, to viewing every battle through the lens of potential finality, to counting days and engagements while wondering if each was the last. The Weirdboy had weaponized my own curiosity against me, turned my refusal into a different kind of prediction that would haunt me regardless. "Proceed with execution," I ordered, my voice carrying the authority of finality. The stormtroopers raised their hell guns. The sanctioned psychers intensified their suppression field, talent crying out as psychic pressure built to levels that made reality feel thin and unstable. The Weirdboy looked at each of us in turn, its gaze lingering on me longest. And then it spoke one final time with perfect clarity, despite all restraints. "Good huntin', boss. Hope you count good in whatever time's left. And, when your final fight comes, when the shape completes for your personal like, I hope you recognize it for what it is, not the end of anything important. Just our last number, in a sequence that was always gonna add up, this way." I gave the signal. The hell guns fired. The Weirdboy's head exploded in a flash of superheated energy, psychic glands rupturing and spraying greenish matter across the restraint throne and surrounding floor. The suppression field flared, containing the psychic backlash that should have torn through the chamber, but which was instead compressed, channeled, dispersed through protocols we had spent days perfecting. The body slumped in its chains, unmistakably dead, no longer radiating the pressure that had made reality feel unstable around it. The execution had been clean, efficient, exactly as planned. No escapes, no final tricks, no psychic assaults that endangered the ship or crew. By every objective measure, it had been a complete success. But as I stood looking at the corpse, at the creature that had spent weeks predicting and counting and describing patterns I couldn't unsee, I felt not relief but a strange emptiness, as though something critical had been removed from my understanding of the war we were fighting. Talon staggered, gasping, and when he spoke his voice was shaking. "It's gone. The pressure, the sense of something vast counting down, just gone, like it was never there. Because the source has been eliminated," I said, needing to believe this was true, needing to believe that killing the Weirdboy had ended whatever influence it had been exerting on our operations and our thinking. But even as I spoke, Vox traffic from the surface began flooding through, emergency reports from multiple sectors simultaneously. Sector 9 to 7. Massive Orc convergence. Forces estimated at company strength. Moving with unexpected coordination toward Imperial positions. Southern agricultural zones. Orc raiders emerging from positions we had classified as cleared. attacking supply lines with precision that suggested advanced planning. Northern industrial sectors, guard patrols reporting contact with greenskin forces that should not exist, that all intelligence suggested had been eliminated weeks ago. Eastern Manufactorum district. Full-scale assault developing, orc mobs moving in patterns that resembled nothing so much as deliberate military maneuvers, as though executing a plan that had been waiting for some specific trigger. I listened to the reports cascade in, watched the tactical displays light up with contact markers across the entire theater of operations, and I felt cold certainty settle in my chest. The Weirdboy had not been creating these patterns, had not been forcing these outcomes through psychic manipulation. It had simply been describing what was already happening, what the accumulated momentum of months of fighting had been building toward, what the shape of violence had demanded would eventually manifest. Its death had not stopped the pattern. Its death had marked the pattern's completion, the moment when all the counting added up, when the Waaagh that we thought we had destroyed reached the size and shape that its momentum had always been building toward. All units, combat alert. I heard Lord Militant Gen ordering through the Vox network, his voice steady but strained. Enemy forces converging from multiple vectors. This is not scattered resistance. Repeat, this is coordinated assault. All positions prepare for sustained engagement. I made my way to the bridge, where Voidmaster Illyra was coordinating the ship's response to the developing crisis below. Tactical displays showed the full scope of what was unfolding. Orc forces that should have been broken and scattered were instead moving with purpose toward objectives that made strategic sense, consolidating around positions that offered defensive advantage, attacking Imperial strongpoints with timing that suggested communication and planning. How is this possible? Illyra demanded, not of me specifically, but of the universe in general, of the fundamental unfairness of an enemy that refused to behave according to established doctrine. We killed their war boss. We destroyed their command structure. They should be disorganized, leaderless, easy to eliminate in detail. Instead, they're fighting like they've been planning this for weeks. They have been, I said quietly. Not planning in the sense of deliberate coordination, but following momentum, following the shape that violence creates when enough force is applied in concentrated areas. We spent months pushing them into exactly these positions, concentrating our forces exactly where they were gathering, creating exactly the conditions for this convergence. Illyra looked at me with incomprehension. You're saying we caused this? That our successful operations somehow resulted in the enemy becoming stronger? I'm saying we followed patterns we thought were tactics, but which were actually just water running downhill. I said, repeating the Weirdboys metaphor because I had no better framework to explain what I was seeing. We made rational decisions based on where the fighting was heaviest, where the enemy was concentrated, where our forces could achieve maximum effect. But every one of those decisions was shaped by circumstances that the accumulated Waaagh momentum had created. We thought we were hunting them. We were actually herding ourselves into the positions they needed us to occupy for this moment. The battle that followed was brutal and extended, lasting 3 standard days of sustained combat across multiple sectors. The orcs fought with a coherence that violated everything we understood about their species, maintaining pressure on Imperial positions while simultaneously defending their own convergence points, as though executing a battle plan that existed not in any war boss's mind but in the collective momentum of the Waaagh itself. We won, eventually. Won through superior firepower and orbital support, through the grinding attrition that was the Imperium's greatest strength, through the simple fact that we could sustain casualties that would have broken any other force. But the victory was hollow, purchased at costs that turned celebration into grim accounting. 3 guard regiments effectively destroyed, 2 entire sectors of the capital hive reduced to rubble, casualties in the tens of thousands, resources expended that would take years to replace, and the worst part, the knowledge that kept me reviewing battle reports long after the fighting had ended, was that I could trace every major engagement back to decisions we had made based on the patterns the Weirdboy had described, not because it had forced us to make those decisions, but because those were the only decisions that made tactical sense given the circumstances we found ourselves in, circumstances that had been shaped by previous decisions, which had been shaped by earlier circumstances, all the way back to the moment the first orc boot touched Tertullian soil. Captain Darren found me in my quarters 3 days after the battle ended, his face showing the kind of exhaustion that came not from physical exertion but from having every certainty challenged. "Inquisitor," he said quietly, "I need to understand something. That creature you were interrogating, the Weirdboy. Did it somehow cause all this? No, I said, and I meant it. It described it. It counted it. It saw the patterns we were following and the momentum we were building, and it told us what shape we were making while we insisted we were making free choices. Then, killing it accomplished nothing. Killing it removed a source of uncomfortable truth, I said. Whether that qualifies as accomplishment depends on how much you value comfortable lies. Darren was silent for a long time, processing this. Finally, he said, "During the fighting, I made decisions that felt wrong but produced better outcomes than my proper tactical choices would have. I found myself thinking in orc logic structures, counting momentum and violence weight the way that creature described, and those thoughts saved lives, Inquisitor. My men survived because I was thinking like a greenskin rather than following doctrine." "I know," I said, because I had done the same, had found myself calculating battles using frameworks the Weirdboy had taught me, had made decisions that violated Imperial tactical doctrine, but which aligned with the underlying shape of violence that the creature had revealed. "Is that corruption?" Darren asked. "Am I compromised? Should I request psychic cleansing, purgation, whatever process removes Xeno's influence from human cognition?" I thought about this carefully before answering. "You're not corrupted. You're aware. The Weirdboy didn't infect you with alien thoughts. It taught you to see patterns that were always there, that were shaping your decisions whether you recognized them or not. Now you see them consciously, can work with them or against them, can make choices with full awareness of the forces acting on you. But it feels wrong. It feels like thinking with enemy logic, because we've been taught that the enemy is simple, stupid, predictable," I said. "But what if they're not stupid? What if they're just operating on logic we don't want to understand, because understanding it means recognizing how much of our own behavior follows similar patterns? What if human free will and orc momentum are not as different as we've been telling ourselves?" Darren left, and I was alone with these thoughts, with the knowledge that I had executed the Weirdboy not because it was wrong but because it was right, because its predictions had been too accurate, because the patterns it revealed were too disturbing to allow to propagate through Imperial consciousness. I had killed it to protect comfortable lies about human agency and tactical sovereignty, had destroyed the mirror that showed us as water flowing downhill while insisting we were climbers ascending through pure will. That night, I dreamed of green tides and counting voices, of numbers arranging themselves into shapes that describe battles not yet fought, of momentum building toward endpoints that felt inevitable despite every effort to avoid them. And when I woke, I found myself automatically counting days since the Weirdboy's death, engagements that had occurred since then, the rhythm and spacing of violence that continued to follow patterns that felt less like strategy and more like gravitational inevitability. I had refused to ask where I would die, had rejected the Weirdboy's offer to predict my personal endpoint, but it had been right about one thing. The question was still in my head, still counting down, and every battle I survived made me wonder if the next would be the one where the shape completed for me personally, where my own momentum reached its inevitable conclusion. I returned to my duties, filed reports that described successful elimination of Xeno's threats and pacification of Tertullus VII, wrote assessments that praised the tactical acumen of Imperial commanders and the resilience of Guard forces. I wrote what protocol demanded, what the Administratum needed to hear, what would justify the resources expended and the lives lost. But in my private logs, in journals that would never be filed with official records, I wrote what I actually believed, that we had not defeated the orcs so much as survived their momentum, that every decision we thought was free choice had been constrained by circumstances we did not create and could not escape, that human will and alien instinct followed similar patterns when viewed from sufficient distance. I wrote these things knowing they would never be read, knowing that if they were discovered I would likely be executed for spreading defeatism or corruption, but I wrote them anyway, because someone had to document the truth, had to count the patterns honestly, had to acknowledge that the Imperium's victories were less absolute than we pretended and our agency less sovereign than we claimed. And in the years that followed, as I continued my service to the Ordo Xenos, I found myself viewing every campaign through the framework the Weirdboy had taught me, seeing momentum where others saw tactics, recognizing patterns where others saw chaos, counting the shapes that violence made while my fellow Inquisitors insisted they were imposing order through force of will. I never spoke of the Weirdboy again. never mentioned its predictions or its philosophy, or the uncomfortable truths it had revealed. But I carried its lessons with me, used its frameworks to understand battles in ways that made me more effective at my duties, while simultaneously making me less certain about what those duties actually accomplished. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between campaigns, I would find myself wondering where and when and how my own counting would complete, what final number I was approaching, what shape I was making that would eventually resolve into whatever ending the momentum demanded. The Weirdboy had offered to tell me. I had refused, but it had been right that the question would remain, would haunt me, would turn every battle into a potential finale that I faced with the knowledge that I might not recognize my end until it arrived, until the last number in the sequence added itself up, and I discovered too late that I had been counting toward it all along. The years passed, and I continued my service to the Ordo Xenos with the kind of methodical dedication that earned commendations and promotions, but never quite silenced the questions the Weirdboy had planted in my consciousness. I investigated Tyranid incursions and Eldar raids, interrogated captured Xenos and studied alien artifacts, filed reports that added to the Imperium's vast accumulation of knowledge about the enemies that pressed against humanity from every direction. I was good at my work, perhaps better than I had been before Tertullus 7th, because I now saw patterns that others missed, recognized momentum in ways that allowed me to predict enemy movements with uncanny accuracy. My fellow Inquisitors attributed this enhanced capability to experience, to the wisdom that came from decades of service and exposure to countless Xenos behaviors. They did not know, could not know, that I was thinking in frameworks taught to me by an orc, counting battles using logic structures that violated everything the Imperium believed about greenskin stupidity and human superiority. Tertullus VII was declared fully pacified 6 months after the Weirdboy's execution, the remaining orc presence eliminated or driven so deep underground that it posed no immediate threat. The planet resumed food production, its agri-machinery repaired and consecrated, its population reinforced with fresh colonists from overcrowded hive worlds. By every official metric, the campaign had been a success. The after-action reports praised the tactical brilliance of Imperial commanders, the courage of Guard regiments, the invaluable intelligence provided by my interrogation of captured Xenos specimens. Only I knew that we had not defeated the Waaagh so much as survived its momentum reaching natural resolution, that the patterns we thought were tactics had been water flowing downhill, that every decision we made had been shaped by forces we neither recognized nor controlled. I returned to Tertullus VII 12 years later, called back by reports of renewed orc activity in sectors we had classified as secure. The local planetary defense forces were handling it adequately, but Fleet Command wanted an experienced Xenos specialist to assess whether this represented new invasion or resurgence of survivors we had failed to eliminate the first time. What I found was disturbing in ways that confirmed every uncomfortable truth the Weirdboy had taught me. The orcs were not invaders. They were the same clans we had destroyed 12 years earlier, grown back from spores and scattered survivors, following the same territorial patterns, gathering in the same concentration points, building toward the same kind of convergence that had marked the previous campaign's climax. It was as though the Waaagh had a shape encoded into the planet itself, a gravitational structure that pulled greenskin behavior into predictable patterns, regardless of how thoroughly we eliminated individual specimens. I spent 3 months on Tertullus VII, studying the renewed orc presence with the analytical tools the Weirdboy had inadvertently provided. I mapped their movements against terrain features, calculated momentum based on violence density rather than tactical objectives, predicted their convergence points using orc counting logic rather than Imperial doctrine. And I was right, consistently right, in ways that made the local military commanders both grateful and unsettled. How do you do it? Lord General Cassian asked me during one briefing, after I had predicted 3 consecutive orc raids with precision that seemed impossible. How do you know where they'll strike before our scouts report movement? It's almost as though you're thinking like them. I am thinking like them, I admitted, because Cassian was a practical man who valued results over orthodoxy. Orcs follow patterns of momentum and violence concentration that are predictable if you learn to recognize them. They're not making strategic decisions in the way we understand strategy. They're following the shape that their Waaagh creates, moving toward points of maximum fighting potential, the way water flows toward points of minimum resistance. Cassian digested this slowly. You're saying they're not intelligent but also not stupid. They're something else. Something that operates on logic we don't normally consider logical. Exactly, I said, pleased that someone finally understood without requiring extensive explanation. And once you learn to see that logic, once you understand the patterns they follow, you can predict them with remarkable accuracy. You can also see when Imperial responses are inadvertently reinforcing those patterns, herding ourselves into positions that serve Orc momentum rather than Imperial objectives. Should we be doing something differently then? Kessian asked. Some alternative approach that doesn't feed into their patterns? I thought about this carefully before answering, because I had spent 12 years considering exactly this question, trying to determine whether it was possible to fight Orcs without following the momentum logic that made our battles predictable. The problem, I said slowly, is that the patterns exist whether we recognize them or not. Violence creates momentum. Momentum creates concentrations. Concentrations create bigger violence. It's a cycle that exists independently of tactics or strategy. The Orcs are simply better at riding it than we are, because they don't fight against it, don't try to impose order on chaos. They become part of the chaos and let it carry them where it wants to go. That sounds like defeatism, Kessian observed, though his tone was curious rather than accusatory. It's realism, I corrected. The Imperium wins battles through superior resources and sustained attrition. We grind the enemy down until they break. That works, but it works because we can afford losses that would destroy any other civilization, not because our tactics are inherently superior to Orc momentum following. And recognizing that, admitting it, doesn't make us weaker. It makes us aware of what we're actually doing versus what we tell ourselves we're doing. The conversation stayed with me as I completed my assessment and prepared to depart Tertullus VII. I included in my report detailed analysis of Orc behavioral patterns and recommendations for tactical approaches that worked with momentum rather than against it, suggestions for how to redirect violence rather than suppress it, how to use the enemy's own patterns against them in ways that required less resource expenditure and produced more favorable outcomes. I had no illusions that my recommendations would be implemented. They required thinking too much like the enemy, required abandoning comfortable certainties about Imperial tactical superiority. But I wrote them anyway, because someone had to document these truths, had to count honestly, had to acknowledge what the Weirdboy had taught me even if that teaching could never be officially recognized. 15 years after the Weirdboy's execution, I faced my own mortality in ways that made its predictions suddenly terribly relevant. The operation was supposed to be straightforward: eliminate a Dark Eldar raiding party that had been taking slaves from an agri-world in a neighboring subsector. Intelligence suggested a small force, isolated from their webway access, vulnerable to swift Imperial response. We deployed with appropriate force composition, 2 companies of Astra Militarum, Space Marine support from the local chapter's scout company, and my own retinue of specialists and sanctioned psychers. The intelligence was wrong. The Dark Eldar presence was 10 times larger than reported, well-equipped and anticipating our arrival, positioned in defensive terrain that turned our assault into a grinding meat grinder. What should have been a quick raid became a protracted battle that lasted 3 days and cost thousands of lives. On the 3rd day, during the final assault on their primary stronghold, I found myself in a collapsed structure with 3 of my retinue, surrounded by enemy forces, our extraction options eliminated by a building collapse that should have killed us, but instead only trapped us in a space too small to maneuver and too exposed to survive long term. As lasfire and splinter weapons pinged off our cover, as our ammunition depleted and our options narrowed, I found myself counting 3 walls still standing, 2 exits both blocked, 1 broken Vox link, 0 reinforcements coming, and I realized I was counting down to 0, recognizing the shape of a situation that had no good endings, that was resolving toward an endpoint that was becoming inevitable with each passing moment. Inquisitor, one of my retinue said quietly. A young interrogator named Liss, who reminded me uncomfortably of what I had been decades earlier, confident, certain, believing that intelligence and training could overcome any challenge. What do we do? I looked at her, at the trust in her eyes, the expectation that I would have answers, would provide the tactical solution that would extract us from this impossible situation, and I realized I had been here before, had been the young officer looking to experience for salvation, had believed that someone older and wiser would always know what to do. The Weirdboy had offered to tell me where and when and how I would die. I had refused. But it had warned me that the question would remain, that I would spend my remaining years wondering if each battle was the final one, if each moment was the completion of the sequence. And I recognized this moment, felt the weight of accumulated momentum, saw the shape of violence resolving toward an endpoint that had probably always been inevitable since the moment I executed the Weirdboy and inherited its counting consciousness. We fight, I told Liss, because that was the only answer that made sense, the only choice available when all other choices had been eliminated by circumstances beyond our control. We make them pay for every second they keep us here, and we trust that our deaths will matter in the larger pattern, that the numbers we're adding to the count will serve the Emperor, even if we don't survive to see the result. Liss nodded, checked her lasgun's charge pack, prepared herself for what was coming, and I felt a strange peace settle over me, because I had finally stopped wondering when my counting would complete, had recognized the moment when the shape resolved, had accepted the answer to the question I refused to ask all those years ago. The Dark Eldar assault came with characteristic cruelty, more interested in prolonging suffering than achieving swift victory. We fought back with everything we had, made them pay in their own blood for every meter they advanced, refused to give them the satisfaction of easy kills. And when my ammunition depleted and my weapons failed, and the enemy closed for final kills, I found myself thinking not of failure or regret, but of patterns and momentum, and the way violence creates shapes that persist beyond individual lives. I thought of the Weirdboy, of its final words about counting and shapes, and the inevitability of sequences resolving toward their natural conclusions. I thought of all the battles I had survived, all the predictions I had made using its frameworks, all the years I had spent seeing patterns that others couldn't perceive because they refused to learn enemy logic. And I thought, maybe this is not the end of anything important, just the last number in a sequence that was always going to add up this way. Reinforcements arrived 17 minutes later, Space Marines breaching through the collapsed structure's roof. Their arrival coincidentally timed because they had finished their assigned objectives faster than expected and returned to support struggling Imperial positions. They extracted us with casual efficiency, secured the area, completed the operation with the kind of overwhelming violence that Astartes applied to every tactical situation. I survived. Liss survived. My entire retinue survived, against odds that had seemed impossible, rescued by timing that felt less like luck and more like inevitability, as though the shape of the battle had demanded we live rather than die, as though the momentum had not yet reached the resolution point I thought I had recognized. As I was being treated for my injuries aboard the evacuation Valkyrie, as adrenaline faded and pain replaced it, I found myself laughing, actually laughing at the absurdity of thinking I had identified my ending when the actual pattern required something else, when the count had not yet completed, when the sequence still had numbers waiting to add themselves up. The Weirdboy had been right about everything, right about patterns and momentum, and the way violence creates shapes that persist beyond individual recognition, right about how questions remain even when answers are refused, right about how counting continues whether we acknowledge it or not. But it had been wrong about one thing, or perhaps I had misunderstood. It had said it could see where I would die, that it knew the answer to the question I refused to ask. But maybe what it actually saw was that I would spend the rest of my life wondering, counting, trying to recognize the moment when the pattern completed, never quite certain whether each battle was the final one or just another number in a sequence that was longer than I could calculate. I returned to my duties with renewed understanding that my service to the Imperium was not about control or victory or imposing human will on alien chaos. It was about counting honestly, about recognizing patterns even when they were uncomfortable, about surviving one battle so I could fight the next, while understanding that each battle was part of a larger shape that I could perceive but could not change. 23 years after the Weirdboy's execution, I prepared my final report to the Ordo Xenos, a comprehensive document that synthesized everything I had learned about Xenos' behavioral patterns and the frameworks required to understand them. I wrote honestly about momentum and violence concentration, about how Waaghs followed predictable patterns if you learned to recognize them, about how Imperial tactics often inadvertently reinforced enemy strategies by following the same underlying logic of where violence concentrates and how it spreads. I did not mention the Weirdboys specifically, did not reference the interrogations, or the predictions, or the counting frameworks it had taught me. But the document was structured according to those frameworks, organized using logic that the creature had revealed, written by someone who had learned to think in patterns that violated orthodoxy while serving orthodoxy more effectively because of that violation. I submitted the report knowing it would likely be filed away unread, dismissed as the theoretical musings of an aging inquisitor whose field experience had given way to philosophical speculation. But I submitted it anyway, because someone had to count honestly, had to document the truths that made service possible, even when those truths were uncomfortable and unwelcome. And as I sealed the document and prepared it for transmission, I found myself thinking one final time about the Weirdboy, about its offer to predict my death, about my refusal and its warning that the question would remain. I thought about all the battles I had survived, all the moments when I had wondered if the pattern was completing, all the years I had spent counting toward an endpoint that continued to recede before me like a horizon that moves as you approach it. Maybe that was the real prediction, the actual counting that the Weirdboy had seen. Not a specific moment of death, but a life spent wondering, spent recognizing patterns while being unable to escape them, spent serving an Imperium that succeeded through momentum rather than strategy while insisting the reverse was true. Maybe the question wasn't, where will I die, but when will I stop counting? And maybe the answer was never. Because once you learn to see patterns, you cannot unsee them, cannot return to comfortable ignorance, cannot stop recognizing the shapes that violence makes, even when recognizing them changes nothing about their inevitable resolution. I sealed my quarters, activated the privacy locks, and prepared for sleep that I knew would be troubled by dreams of green momentum and counting voices and patterns that persisted beyond death, because they were never about individuals in the first place, only about the larger structures that individuals moved within while believing they were making free choices. And before I surrendered to exhaustion, I allowed myself one moment of honest acknowledgement, one recognition of what the Weirdboy had actually taught me beyond tactics and predictions. I will never again mistake madness for ignorance, or prophecy for chance.